And welcome to the New South Wales Community of Policy Professionals webinar series. My name is Louisa Mamouni, and our webinar today is on a policy practitioner's perspective on responding to crises. As host of the meeting and behalf of the community of policy professionals, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today, no matter where you are joining us from, and recognise this land was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and give a warm welcome to any Aboriginal people who may be joining us today. And I'm especially glad to celebrate a small milestone with Joanne Wilkie, who's joining us. This is our 10th webinar for this year, and it's been a great rate of participation from across the sector. So thank you very much for joining us. Now, Joanne Wilkie is the Deputy Secretary of Economic Strategy and Productivity in New South Wales Treasury, and also the Chair of the Board of the Community of Policy Professionals. Joanne joined Treasury in early 2019 after working in Canberra for over 20 years, including on a diverse range of topics, including gender, regulation, agriculture and energy, and no doubt will be drawing on this experience and her own observations from New South Wales and our more recent crises this year, drought, bushfire and COVID-19. And she'll be talking through the role of policy practitioners during periods of crisis and what we can do to prepare and to respond. 2020 seems to be a good year to reflect on this crisis topic. And earlier in the year, we heard from Shane Fitzsimmons from Resilience talk about bushfire and Michelle Creticos from Health on the COVID pandemic. And we also heard from Peter Shergold and Peter Ryan on learning from policy failure and how to avoid policy pitfalls. Helping to bring this all together and make sense of our role during crisis, I'm very much looking forward to today's presentation from Joanne, and I hope you are too. So after the main presentation, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and I'll put more instructions on how to do that in the chat. Over to you, Joanne.
Thank you, Louisa. Sorry, everybody, just bear with me while I pull up my slides, and hopefully you can all hear me. So thank you, Louisa, for that amazing introduction. I almost don't need the introduction for myself now. I'd just like to, before I get started in my presentation proper, very much thank Louisa, Stephanie Croft and the other members of the team who are responsible for making the ComPrac run every month and supporting all of these webinars. I'm very much of the view that although you can study policy academically and theoretically, it really is one of those professions that you learn as an apprenticeship, and ComPracs and communities of practice and these sorts of opportunities to be able to share insights on how we do what we do, I find are really, really important, and they've certainly been a large contributor to my expertise building in the time I've been a policy practitioner. So a very big thank you to those who help out and support the ComPrac. Before I get started, Louisa's already introduced the subject matter and me, so I won't go through that again. Just a couple of caveats before I get started. The views in this presentation are mine and not those of New South Wales Treasury, and I'm delivering this presentation under Chatham House rules. Louisa's already done a wonderful acknowledgement of country, but I too would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands from where you're coming from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this virtual meeting. I also would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I think that acknowledgement's particularly visceral this week, given that it's NAIDOC week and we're celebrating the achievement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, their cultures and the contribution that they make to our community in New South Wales. I'm a little bit rushed this morning because I've actually just come from a NAIDOC event that I was officiating at for New South Wales Treasury. The image you can see on the screen there, if it's not hidden by by the images of people and me talking is of the New South Wales Treasury Reconciliation Action Plan artwork that we had commissioned from an Indigenous artist, Josie Rose, that we've just unveiled in an official ceremony this morning. So this artwork represents the people and the land of New South Wales and New South Wales Treasury's commitment to working together with our Aboriginal communities to make it a prosperous place for us all to live and raise our children. So that's been a fantastic event to have been involved in this morning. So forgive me for spending a little bit of time on that, but I think it's really important at any time, but particularly in NAIDOC Week. So one of the things that I've learnt from Welcomes to Country and from our Indigenous, my Indigenous colleagues is the importance of talking a little bit about yourself and a little bit of a reflection at the beginning of a presentation like this. So you can get to know me a little bit, and so that you can get to know, and so that you've got a way of judging how much to heart you should take what I'm going to say. So a little bit about me. I'm a mother to two beautiful children that you can see there. I'm an aunt and I'm a daughter, and those family connections are very important to me. I grew up in Bundjalung in the Northern Rivers area of New South Wales. My children were born in Ngunnawal in Canberra, and we now live in Gadigal country. And those movements and what they represent in my life is very important too. As Louisa said, I've spent the better part of just over 20 years now as an economic policy advisor. Majority of that in the Commonwealth government across various agencies, and now of course in the New South Wales Public Service. Other things that are important to me: diversity and inclusion champion, which was partly why the NAIDOC event this morning meant so much to me. I like the role I play as an organisational leader, and then I'm a reader and a yoga practitioner. In terms of work and some of the crises that Louisa alluded to, this chart just shows across my career some of the crises, in inverted commas, that I've been involved in one way or another in the different departments that I've worked in. So I won't spend too much time on this slide at the moment. I'm going to pick up some of these events as case studies a little bit further in the presentation. And I'm happy to get questions about any of the things represented on the screen later in the presentation. So before we get started, because what I want to try and do in this presentation is, one, give you a little bit of a theoretical framework for how to think about crises in a policy context, but also, as Louisa said, really focus on what is the role of a policy practitioner in the midst of a crisis. So the first thing is, policy is one of those things that's a bit hard to define. So this slide, and the colours don't have any meaning, so don't focus on the colours. This slide shows the various actors in the policy world, and the focus that I want to say in this presentation, as I said, is on policy practitioners. So those bits, that group of us right in the middle there, those who sit in that grey area between politics and public administration. So political actors are ministers and the ministerial staff who consider all the political implications of a policy proposal. Public administrators are those who implement decisions, regulators, program managers, service deliverers. And policy practitioners, like I said, are that group of people in the middle, staff in central agencies or policy specialists in line agencies who provide detailed policy advice about a measure, how to solve a problem, that sort of thing. So policy is always a little bit hard to define, but that's the group of people I'm talking about. Now, what about crisis? Louisa's already mentioned a few different things that you can think about when you think about crises. You can think about a natural disaster like a fire or a flood. You could think about an emergency like a drought or a pandemic. And not all crises are equal either. For those of you who know Douglas Adams, that's not a crisis, that's the crisis when they come to destroy Earth. So there are different types of crises. Sometimes, like I said, it might be an emergency or a policy failure or a scandal. I imagine down in Canberra today, following Four Corners last night, there's a sense of crisis in some departments and ministerial offices. A crisis is I'll get to the definition I'm going to use of crisis here, but some of these things presented on this slide between situational and institutional, sudden or creeping crises, these are all different ways that a crisis can unfold. Some of these things might end up being a crisis in the way I'm going to define it, and some of them might just be issues to be managed. In some ways, it doesn't really matter whether it's a crisis or not under the theoretical definition I'm going to give you here. The techniques of responding to a lot of these things from a policy practitioner's point of view are pretty similar. They're techniques that you'll be able to use in any of these types of situations, but ones that become particularly relevant when you are dealing with a true full-blown crisis. So, what's a crisis? So if you just take the dictionary definition, a crisis is a time of intense difficulty or danger. Some of the policy, public policy academics that I've found particularly useful in the way they define crisis is in this book by Boyne, T. Hart, Stern and Sunderless. And they actually use, they have a very useful definition that basically involves three characteristics. Threat, so a threat to widely held values like safety and security, integrity, civil liberties might be threatened by violence. So for example, you can consider this also if a critical infrastructure supporting electricity or telecommunications goes, and that breaks down and potentially disrupts our daily routine for a prolonged period of time, then that will be a threat to social values as well. When you've got a crisis, a threat usually involves more than one cause, and often those causes actually interact to produce an even bigger threat. The interesting thing about this and the way this definition of crisis works is that the threat to some extent is socially constructed, because it is a threat not just to physical safety, but to the values that a society holds dear. And that means the threat is inherently political. The second characteristic that Boyne and his colleagues emphasise is urgency. The threat is something that must be addressed now. It's a clear and present danger. It's not just a creeping crisis like in the previous slide, but it is something that has to be addressed now. Again, that's something that sense of urgency is something that can be framed and it can be socially constructed. Less likely if there's a natural disaster as the threat or the initial threat, but that might be more likely if you're talking about a policy failure that's heading towards being a crisis. The third characteristic is uncertainty. So heightened uncertainty about the threat, what's going on, what's happening, how did it happen, what's going to happen next, how bad is it going to be? So that's something that we've certainly seen in the early part of this year with COVID. A lot of the uncertainty came from we just didn't know what was going to happen next. But in a crisis, there's also significant uncertainty about what the solutions are. What can we do about this? What happens if we select option A or option B, and not really having a clear framework or set of professional judgments about exactly what is going to happen if you implement solution A or solution B. The fourth characteristic that I've added to the three identified by Boyne and his colleagues is actually collective stress. In the work that I've taken this definition from, Boyne and his colleagues talk a lot about collective stress, but they haven't actually added it as a fourth characteristic. I have, because in my experiences with dealing with crisis, this is something that is absolutely pervasive. This idea that people, in COVID's a really good example, a really, really good example, because the communal fear of getting the virus that we particularly saw impacting on people's movements and how people were living their lives earlier in the year. So this collective stress results not just from the objective threat, but it can also be because of the interaction between the media, other events, individual perceptions and fears, and how reactions, all that kind of thing. So a point that I just wanted to make in this slide too is, and I'm sure you've probably all noticed this as I've been talking through on the slide, what's common to all four of these characteristics, that they're all affected by differences in perspective or perception. if you get in early and frame some of these things, you might be able to head off a crisis, or you might actually be able to build a situation into a crisis, because then that gives you an opportunity to act. So I think this is a really key insight for policy practitioners, because when you're caught up in a crisis, you really need to keep in mind that the crisis is going to have an operational element and it is going to have a political element, and policy is going to end up being stuck in the middle. The operational response is going to be going on at the same time as the policy practitioners are trying to pull together briefs to ministers on what's going on, what we should do about it, which is going on at the same time that ministers are in the public eye trying to make sense to the public of what's going on. My experience also is that the more political a crisis, the more intense it's going to be for policy practitioners. The other thing to remember is that your staff in the ministerial office and the minister themselves are also going to have to be dealing with this two-pronged crisis, the operational aspect of it as well as the political aspect of it. And that can mean that sometimes they're distracted from one by the other. So I just wanted to put in a caveat here, because I certainly know as a junior policy practitioner, I used to get a little bit nervous anytime some of my seniors started talking about politicians and what was going on in politics. Part of the prime directive of being a political practitioner is, of course, to be impartial. But to be an effective policy advisor, you also really do need to understand the political environment and the context in which you're providing advice. A good rule of thumb here is one given by the former Governor-General Peter Cosgrove, who said, "It's your job to understand the political dimensions, understand them, not comment on them, and not to participate in them and not to promote them." And I think that's a really good rule of thumb for policy practitioners when we're inevitably drawn into having to think about the policy aspects of the political aspects of something that we're dealing with. So that's what a crisis is. What happens next? So this slide is the 5 steps to effective crisis management that Boyne and his colleagues set out in their book about the politics of crisis management for how leaders can effectively manage a crisis. First one is sense making. And so what I've also tried to do is set out on this slide is what the leaders need to do to effectively manage a crisis, but what then that means policy practitioners need to be doing to support leaders in managing the crisis. So in the sense making, in the early stages of a crisis, it's about identifying the crisis and leaders understanding the significance of what's going on. That's what leaders are doing. At the same time, what policy practitioners are doing is frantically collecting and analysing information, including stakeholder impact and views. And that's something that goes on throughout a crisis, but it's particularly important at this early stage of the crisis to get a firm grasp on what's going on and what might happen next. Then you pretty quickly get into the stage where decisions start needing to be made, and more importantly, almost than just making the decisions, is coordinating them. Leaders are needing to make critical calls on strategic dilemmas about how to deal with operational issues and that sort of thing. And they're also needing to coordinate a coherent response across government and to implement decisions. So sort of example there is some of the, referring back to some of Shane Fitzsimmons' comments, for example, some of the lack of coordination that happened at times during the bushfire crisis when the Commonwealth offered Defence Force help and that sort of thing, in terms of not letting New South Wales know and then New South Wales not necessarily knowing how to deploy those resources and that sort of thing. So what are policy practitioners doing in this stage? They're devising ways to rapidly assess options, they're recommending courses of action, they're trying to coordinate implementation and then monitoring delivery for effectiveness. One of the really important stages then in any crisis is the third stage here, meaning making. Leaders and politicians being able to get out in the public eye and offer a narrative for what's going on that's convincing, helpful and inspiring to people who might be or who are suffering collective stress. And again, it's really important. Policy practitioners have a really important role then to support that in terms of coming up with those narratives and recommending them, in terms of being able to explain the situation and its implications, and being able to then support practically the communication of that narrative. So, for example, our colleagues at DCS during the COVID crisis have really played an incredibly important role during COVID in supporting the Premier and the government's communication of messages, including by then government advertising, messages on social media and that sort of thing. So that, don't underestimate the impact of that practical and pragmatic issue of how are you going to communicate the narrative, not just what are you going to communicate, but how are you going to communicate it. The fourth step here is accounting. So this is when you've sort of moved past the peak of the crisis and you're starting to ask questions, and the public is starting to ask questions about what happened and who was responsible for that. So this is where leaders need to explain publicly about what had been done to prevent that crisis, what they've done to manage that crisis, so that everybody can start moving on. So again, this becomes a really busy stage for policy practitioners in doing that forensic interrogation of what happened. Could we have done something to prevent it? What governance processes did we have in place? What are we going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again? And then that leads very much into the learning phase, where leaders publicly need to draw lessons. They will often make promises about repairing what can be reconstructed or rebuilt. There will often be conversations about reforming things that were found wanting in the midst of the crisis. And again, there's a heavy load that falls on the policy practitioners in that space, determining the causes of the crisis, the strengths and weaknesses, and then implementing remedial actions or reforms. And that part of the crisis can have a very long tail. So that's what happens in a crisis, in a theoretical framework for thinking through what happens in a crisis. One of the things that I think is really important there, and it comes through in a lot of them, and it comes through in the definition of crisis, is how you frame things. So this idea of meaning making and about what makes an effective narrative is really important. So there's a piece of work that's actually just very recently come out by Minter and O'Connor, who are looking at the importance of policy narrative in the COVID context, predominantly looking at it in the United States. But they're emphasising what makes why policy narratives are so important, and particularly relevant as we're just seeing the unfolding of what's happening in the US election. So why do we need policy narratives? Because facts don't actually speak for themselves, unfortunately, or not, how you might think about that, but facts don't speak for themselves. How you present them does matter. And in a crisis, it's particularly important that leaders engage in meaning making so that the public can understand what is happening. Again, that comes back to, remember, the public, just like the leaders and the policy practitioners and anyone who's involved in the process, is also suffering a sense of collective stress. So making meaning for people, to tell them what's going on, how they should think about it, what should happen next is really important. So what makes a successful policy narrative? It provides a persuasive account of what's happening and why, creates a broad coalition of support for what the government is doing, encourages trust and cooperation, particularly if you might get to the point of, say, during the bushfire emergency, of having to order evacuations of communities and that sort of thing. And then it enables individuals and communities to make informed decisions for themselves. So how do we do that? How do you make sure that you've got an effective narrative to influence the policy success? Consistent messages are really important. Making sure you include in those messages local content so that people can relate it to them and to their context. And then aligning talk and action. So walking the talk, making sure you're actually delivering on what you're saying you're going to deliver on. So that brings to the end a bit of this, the part of the presentation that I sort of wanted to provide you with a theoretical framework. So now I just wanted to talk through what it's actually like in a crisis. So I wanted to have a look in particular. So the main thing is in a crisis, and if you've ever been dealing with any sort of issue with where the minister is demanding answers right now on what he should do or he or she should do and what's going on, it's fast-paced, it's high pressure, it's high stakes, it is absolutely intense. Deadlines are short, there's competing demands, the stakes are really high, and it's incredibly emotional and incredibly stressful. And everyone on down in the department who's dealing with that. So what does that actually mean? So if you're thinking about individuals, and I mean here leaders and policy practitioners, there's a lot of research that's been done about the way the human brain makes decisions. Under uncertainty, our brains will take shortcuts. They will go to subconscious decision making, which means you're subject to cognitive bias, and you can end up making the wrong decision because your subconscious has gone there. It hasn't necessarily been a conscious decision. It's fast, but it can lead to bias. So there are advantages in that, but there are also disadvantages. We also know a lot about decision making under stress. A small amount of stress can enhance decision making, but high levels of it can really enhance it. So from your point of view, a policy practitioner's point of view, what does that mean? Professional rules of thumb, and I don't necessarily mean policy rules of thumb, but you might be a lawyer, you might be an economist, you might be a medically trained. Your professional rules of thumb will help you assess a situation and be able to make recommendations quickly. That's fine, use that, but check your assumptions against what's actually happening. Make sure you start seeking out new data sources. Use your networks, including talking to those on the ground, to again check your assumptions and to test what you're thinking and what recommendations you're making. And most importantly, like I said, it's emotionally and stressful. Look after yourself and look after your team and stay mindful about what it is you're doing. So what about decision makers? In a crisis, we also have a tendency to centralise decision making and reduce the size of the decision making group. Again, COVID is a good example. We have a crisis policy committee that's a small group of ministers and senior public officials who've been meeting every week during COVID to make decisions about what's going on. That's good. It's nimble, it's agile, it's a good way to get key people in the room to make decisions quickly. But again, studies show us that small groups like that can lead to groupthink, or that group of people might end up being out of touch with the broader network, and it could lead to incoherent responses or responses that don't take into account everything. So what are some of the checks that you can put in to guard against that? Make sure you're getting the right information to the decision makers at the right time. Keep sense making, keep undertaking that work to understand what's happening, what are the impacts, what you can do about it, what might happen next. And make sure you coordinate with colleagues in other part of the policy and response network so that you can get all of the different perspectives and views from what's happening across the set. It's also a good idea to think about what is actually going on in the organisation. There's often during a crisis, excuse me, a sense of fear, particularly at senior levels. The crisis, senior people are going to be the ones who are talking directly to the minister and directly to staff. So in that sense, they're going to be quite close to the people who are most stressed out about this. Leaders will often be distracted. There's a whole suite of things leaders at any particular point in time are dealing with. And the crisis is likely to crowd out everything else. Some teams in the organisation are going to be absolutely under the pump. You're going to end up with resources being diverted into a whole heap of different things, and there's going to be a contest of views inside the department or inside the organisation about what's happening and what you should be doing about it. So that means the organisation itself needs to pivot. It needs to, particularly if it looks like the crisis is going to be long-lived. You potentially need to reprioritise things. You need to manage the impacts on those highly affected teams and support them. You might need to delegate, leaders in the organisation might need to delegate responsibility for some projects. You need to make sure that you're sharing information across teams and across the organisation on what is going on. You need to keep an eye on employee wellbeing. You need to use the diversity of views that are coming up productively and not let them get into the point where you're paralysed because there's a contest of views inside the department about what things mean or what should be done about it. And in some cases, if there's a scandal involving a regulatory action or there's a crisis of that sort of nature, you may even need to be undertaking a rapid review of the organisation's practices and its governance as part of the crisis, which again is where you can end up with those resources being put to things. So that's kind of the general feeling of what's going on in a crisis. Next, I wanted to sort of draw on, I guess, I've given you the theoretical framework, of what happens in a crisis, but here's kind of what to expect in a chronological order, I guess, based on my experience of crises and what it looks like from the perspective of a policy practitioner. So first, there's some sort of inciting event. It might be a natural disaster, might be an audit report, could be a high court case, it could be a 60 Minutes or Four Corners expose, could be an outbreak of an illness, a terrorist attack, a Royal Commission finding, a business collapse, could be anything, a whole range of things that might actually be this inciting event that when you look back on it and say, that's what started the crisis. Then you've got a series of complicating factors. It might be the media's presentation of the problems, saying that this is actually a crisis, the media framing the crisis. It might be political issues that are compounding factors or complicating factors. So, for example, Australia Post and the Cardiac Watches being raised at Senate estimates. The political issues around that in terms of fraud and corruption and other stories that were circulating at a similar time sort of pushed some of that stuff into more in the crisis and situation and gave a lot of complicating issues there. It could be public outrage that is the complicating factor. For example, you might remember the live sheep export, when live sheep exports were stopped after there was that ship with all of those sheep dying exposed on 60 Minutes, that stirred animal groups into operation, and they started stirring up public outrage and calling for immediate action. Then there's the system overload or failure. So this is when the initial inciting event with those complicating factors starts spilling over into other parts of the economy or society. And that's also when you sort of start seeing evidence of collective stress in the general community. Now, to me, you actually need all three of those things to really have a crisis. If you've only got one or two of them, then to me it's probably an issue or an emergency or a policy failure. Like I said, if you're in the middle of working on that, it might still very much feel like a crisis, but in terms of the broad scope of things that I'm talking about, probably doesn't quite make the category, but doesn't mean it makes you feel any better when you're caught in the middle of it. But to me, it's those three things that you need when you finally hit that system failure or overload. Now you've got a crisis. And that's when you start moving into the simultaneous response, analysis and storytelling. You need to rapidly analyse about what's going on, record and collective responses that might include government agencies, NGOs, businesses, citizens. And that's the point where you really need to start telling the story of what's happening and being convincing and compelling in what you're saying. And then finally, you hit this long tail of recovery, reform, rebuilding, responsibility, and working out who was or wasn't responsible, why wasn't it stopped before it happened, how do we make sure it doesn't happen again. You might be rebuilding what's been damaged, and you might be reforming things to make sure it doesn't happen again. So that's what to expect. Now, as a policy practitioner, what are you going to do about it? Like I said, it's those first three factors there. Now you've got the crisis. And that's where, if we think back to Boyne and his colleagues saying about the 5 steps, that's where you're starting to undertake the sense making, identifying a crisis, starting to do that sense making of what's going on. That stage around simultaneous response is equivalent to the decision making, coordinating and meaning making. And then this final bit here is about the accounting and learning. So that's just sort of how you fit the two ways of looking at what happens in a crisis together from my perspective. So now I just wanted to quickly take you through some case studies of crises that I've been involved in using this sort of double framework here. So the first one I wanted to talk to you about briefly was the global financial crisis. So I was working in Commonwealth Treasury during the time of the global financial crisis in the macro dynamics area, so the area that was responsible for providing macroeconomic policy. So was right in the middle of this particular crisis as well, although at a much more junior level, which is did change my perspective, I guess, on what was happening and what we were doing about it. The inciting incident here, or the inciting event, was of course when we started to see a series of bank collapses coming from the subprime mortgage market in the US. And then there was contagion that spread that around the world. So part of the complicating factor here was the way it spread around the world. The complicating factor in Australia, because remember, we didn't see any bank failures. We didn't see any lenders, any big companies go down as a direct result of the subprime mortgage issues. The complicating factors here were that we recently had a change in government from Liberal National to the Labor Party. And of course, in our country, at the Commonwealth level, the Liberal National Party have a reputation as being the better economic managers. And there was a lot of talk at the time that, the way Howard and Costello had left the state affairs in terms of the economy meant that the government was able to manage the crisis well from a fiscal policy perspective. At the same time, Wayne Swan, who was Treasurer at the time during the global financial crisis, was actually named Finance Minister of the Year by Money because of the way Australia handled the crisis. We didn't go into an economic recession. We did have a little bit of an economic downturn, but we also didn't see a financial crisis in our financial sector. But we did see increase in the unemployment rate, and there was certainly a period of heightened uncertainty. But we came through that without a recession. So there was a lot of complicating factors, both in terms of the systemic issues that we were facing from an economic policy point of view, but also this political narrative and this political story, political argy-bargy that was going on about who were the best economic managers in Australia. We started to get the system overload and failure when we started seeing, Lehman Brothers in particular, when they fell over. The Commonwealth Treasury Secretary at the time, Ken Henry's comment to Kevin Rudd was, "This is going to reverberate through the markets. We are in uncharted waters about how to handle this crisis." So you've got this sense of overload in the system. My sister is a food scientist. She doesn't really pay much attention to current events. The global financial crisis and after Lehman Brothers fell was one of the very, very few times that I've had a phone call from my sister saying, "What is going on in the economy? Am I going to lose my house?" And for me, that was the point in time when this really became, oh, this is serious. I was working on these issues, but for me, there was a little bit of the contempt of the familiar because I'd known about this issue and that it was building for months and months before, because the subprime mortgage issues had started well before we started seeing bank failures. And so that, like I said, there's a little bit of the contempt of the familiar that, oh, this is just an insider's issue kind of thing. It's not something that is affecting the country. So when I suddenly started getting phone calls from my sibling who has a PhD but doesn't really particularly pay attention to current events, I was like, okay, now I see, now I get it kind of thing in terms of that sense of collective stress. So then there was the immediate response, monetary policy, go hard, go early, go households and other fiscal measures. There were bank deposit guarantees that were put in place, building banking regulations, lending standards, and that sort of stuff as part of the response. And then this is definitely one where there has been an ongoing contest in terms of the reform and reconstruction and rebuilding. And I guess this ongoing contest of who won the crisis from that who is the best economic manager's point of view. So things like, there's constantly questions being asked still about, did we spend too much on stimulus in the grand GFC in Australia? Was it the stimulus or the mining boom or better regulation that meant we pulled through it as well as we did? So a couple of lessons for this in terms of insights to take away. The earlier you identify a crisis, you might be able to head it off. So in Australia, we were able to get in early and do things before we had banking collapses. So things like the bank deposit guarantees made a difference here. And then, like I said, the policy responses are still to this day contested. So closing out this particular crisis took a while. And in some ways, as an economic policy advisor, I would say they're still not fully closed out, because they're still coming up in the context of how you deal with an economic recession and COVID pandemic. So that's case study number one. Case study number 2 is when I was working in the energy sector in the Commonwealth government during when South Australia went black. So you might remember in September 2016, there was a once in a 100-year storm that hit South Australia, and the entire state of South Australia lost electricity for a few hours in that evening. Now, that in itself, a blackout, even though it was a statewide blackout, that was the inciting event, but that wasn't necessarily what created the crisis. This is one where the political framing and the representations of that event created massive complications. So literally on the day of that storm, the evening of that storm, the South Australian Senator Nick Xenophon was actually on the 7:30 report that night. He started saying that although he supported renewable energy, the way South Australia's government had been handling renewable energy was they hadn't been handling it properly, and that was what caused the blackout. You might also then remember that people like Barnaby Joyce, the then Deputy Prime Minister, jumped on the bandwagon and started making comments like wind power wasn't working well to last night in South Australia. And then you had people like the Prime Minister saying that state governments had paid little or no attention to energy security, and that was what had caused the crisis. And then you had people like Sarah Hanson-Young saying it was pathetic that people were politicking about this, while there were emergency service officers and volunteers were flat out responding to the crisis or responding to the blackout. And so it went on. And that was in the first 24 hours of that storm hitting, that all of these people came out and made very political statements about a blackout. As it turned out, the reason for the blackout was quite a technical issue, which is the cartoon across there, in terms of it was actually the fuse box is putting it in slightly too familiar terms, but there was a set of technical settings in the wind turbines that actually caused a large part of the problem. So again, in terms of that sort of period where you're going through and accounting what happens, it was a very technical issue that the market operator hadn't been aware of a particular setting on part of the network, which was what actually caused the blackout when you started looking at it forensically. So the system overload, we had this set of complicating factors where a storm causing a blackout, which was a technical failure and a technical oversight, has been blown up into a massive issue around climate change and that sort of thing, to not too fine a point on it. Because remember, this was in the 2016 election, where as part of that election and coming out of that election after winning it, Malcolm Turnbull put a machinery of government changing that moved the energy department from the industry department into the environment department, and quite clearly said, my government is going to bring climate change policy and energy policy together. And then within a matter of months, you had this event and you had all of these politicians coming out and making statements about you can't have energy security with renewables in the system and all of these kinds of things. So that led to the COAG Energy Council announcing a major review of the national electricity market that was led by Alan Finkel. So that was announced in, I think it was sort of October, November. It was announced a little bit later, and that review was to run for 12 months. But in the meantime, the Commonwealth Government, having made this big statement about we're bringing climate change and energy policy together, the Energy Security Task Force under Alan Finkel was set up. But in the intervening period, the Commonwealth Government started addressing a whole heap of other energy issues that Explorer had issues with. So electricity prices, there were a whole heap of initiatives around retail electricity prices. There was a whole heap of stuff being done in the gas market, energy efficiency measures, and then finally we had the National Electricity Guarantee coming out of the Alan Finkel process. So where did that all lead us to? Well, the neg is dead. Long live reliability guarantee, long live default prices, long live backing new generation, power generation. Prime Minister Scott Morrison in September 2018 finally put this long tail of policies that had come out of this crisis to bed by saying it was dead. This is definitely an example where there were two very distinct parts of this crisis: the operational issue in terms of getting the power back on in South Australia, and then this much longer running political dimension to the crisis. And this is also one where for years, this crisis played out, it's been subject to ongoing framing and reframing by all the key proponents. And then we had a consensus for reform, and we didn't ever really achieve it in any meaningful way, despite the nature of the crisis. So, final case study that I just wanted to quickly take you through, bushfires of this year. So obviously we had the inciting events or fires in New South Wales from August through to January. The complicating factor was, of course, a lot of journalists and media deciding to make a particular point of the Prime Minister's trip to Hawaii in December, but also, of course, bringing in the climate change argument came up a lot, and climate change denial accusations and all of that sort of thing. So those were a lot of the complicating factors there. Plus, of course, then you get to system overload because of the sheer number of fires that we had in New South Wales at the time and across the rest of the country, and the collective stress that came from that. And then, so the simultaneous response, we had fires still burning, we had communities being evacuated, we had the entire state blanketed in smoke. And then, as I mentioned before, the ongoing issues of coordination between the state and the Commonwealth in terms of responding to the crisis. And again, that sense of collective stress and the emotional and other strong reactions as a whole heap of disagreements about how to respond to this actually played out in public during that period. And so then we've also had the New South Wales government's released its bushfire inquiry report in terms of getting to that sort of final stage of rebuilding and reform, as has the Commonwealth. And of course, we've still got rebuilding going on in communities now in terms of responding to the fires and communities rebuilding from that. So again, here, this is one good example of how identifying and responding to a crisis early can give a leader a first mover advantage in framing the crisis, the importance of coordinating the operational responses, and how storytelling, not just by leaders, but by the media and other groups, is really important in managing the collective stress of the public, but also the messaging around the crisis. So, what does it mean for you as a policy practitioner? So I've got a slide here where I'm just going to take you through some of the things that I think as a policy practitioner are really key to keep close to you when you're dealing with a crisis, and they'll help you navigate the problem even though you have no idea of what the solution to the problem might be. So the first thing I think that's really important to have as a policy advisor or policy practitioner in a crisis is the ability to tell stories about what we're doing, how we're delivering it, and why we're doing it. The next thing is a sense of intellectual and professional curiosity. To analyse information about what's going on, find new sources of information. So, for example, in the recession that we're facing as part of COVID, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has created a whole new set of data series that help us monitor on a fortnightly basis what's going on in the economy rather than waiting for monthly data drops. And we're also accessing, say, bank credit card data to also help us with those sorts of issues. Check your professional assumptions, look for new ways of assessing policy in a truncated period of time. Crises are always a period of time where you end up with policy on the run, which means you can't spend months doing a business case assessment or a regulatory impact statement. So what ways could you do, how could you assess those policies in an objective way, but in a much shorter period of time? Can you find ways of being able to do that? So I think the ComPracs had webinars by people like Ophelia, some of the jobs calculators and other ways that Treasury has come up with being able to assess some of these policies quickly. The next one is be prepared. You might not know the exact dimensions of a crisis or when it's going to arrive, but you can be sure that one crisis will eventually arrive in your area. What sort of planning have you done around thinking about what sort of advice might you give in a worst case scenario situation? How are you and your team going to handle the stress of a situation like that? The next one is, listening to your peers and colleagues to find out what they're experiencing thinking. Do they have a different view to you? Can you reconcile those views? Do you need to adapt your view, or do you need to convince somebody else that they need to adapt their views? Do they have information that you don't that is influencing the way they're thinking about what's going on? Who else might you need to talk to understand the situation? A strong sense of integrity and professionalism. There are a lot of shortcuts that happen in a crisis. So as much as you can, you should stick to good governance, record your advice and decisions, devise some new protocols if you have to, but in the end, the crisis will finish and the auditor will come along, and making sure that you have abided by appropriate protocols and processes and governance as even in the midst of a crisis is really important. Common sense and a willingness to take risks. In a crisis, more than any other time, you are going to have to make risk-based decisions. Do I have enough information to be able to make this recommendation to my minister or not? You're going to have to take a calculated risk about that. You're never going to have all the information you might in a crisis, and you have to work out when is the best time to get that information and that recommendation to your minister. Keep calm. It's going to be a long, hot crisis. You need to keep yourself and your team match fit, which is much about the intensity and the hours you might be working as it is about being able to manage the stress in the circumstances, and being able to get advice to who needs it and when. And to be honest, to be able to manage their stress, because your bosses are going to be stressed, your leaders are going to be stressed, your minister's going to be stressed as well. So keeping calm is really, being able to keep calm and spread that calm amongst your team members is really important. And finally, the most important thing is that ability to be able to create meaning, be able to cope with the ambiguity and the ongoing change and the ongoing uncertainty. And circling back to the top, this is about being able to tell that story to create meaning for others in that ambiguity and uncertainty and ongoing change. So, final remarks. I just wanted to quickly touch on 3 paradoxes of crises, because I pretty much run out of time in terms of questions, but I can run a little bit over if people have got some questions. So the first one is the control paradox. Everybody assumes and expects leaders to be in charge in a crisis, but leaders are embedded in institutions, and leaders, as much as everyone likes to kind of roll their eyes over Scott Morrison's joke, he was absolutely correct. He doesn't hold a hose, but he still has a very important role to play as a leader in a crisis. But this is that control paradox. Leaders aren't holding the hoses, but they are being held to account by the public in how they lead and manage the crisis nonetheless. There's a planning paradox. Crisis planning helps more than a crisis plan ever will. The public expects us to have a crisis plan for every sort of eventuality. I can pretty much guarantee you that the next crisis we come across is not going to be one we have a plan for. However, the process of going through planning, who are you going to talk to? Who are the people that you need to have in place to be able to make decisions? Where are you going to get your information? That process of planning and understanding how you might react and where you're going to get your information from in a crisis is really important, and that can play a very big role in being able to manage the crisis effectively. And then finally, the reform paradox. It's very much a set piece of received wisdom in policy circles that crisis provides the opportunity for reform. When you actually start looking at it, there are very, very few reforms that have actually eventuated out of crisis. And that's because there's this inherent paradox between a crisis is actually something that attacks our core values, is something something, as is reform. Reform is actually about getting in there and saying the way we normally do things doesn't work, we have to change it all up. Whereas when you're dealing with a crisis, you're actually trying to say to people, it's okay, our core systems are actually okay, we will continue to be able to make this work. So there is this inherent tension between crisis and reform. It's not impossible to achieve reform out of a crisis, but you actually have to work harder at it than you think. So that's the end of the presentation. Louisa, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And we've got a few minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please pop it in the chat with everyone, and then I'll try and cross live to you. Just while people are thinking of their questions, I've got one for you, Joanne. So I was wondering about kind of preparedness for crisis, and I was wondering about the role of the public service in that. If we're being fully effective, should there be no crises, and is our job really to prevent crises, at least attempt to, as far as we are able to influence?
That's a really good question. I think it comes, so there are certain types of crises that we should absolutely be held to account for trying to prevent. So say, for example, live sheep. One of the reasons that the live sheep export ban was a crisis for the Department of Agriculture when I was working there was because that department had actually faced a series of significant regulatory failures that were failures because of their governance and processes not being up to scratch. So those sorts of crises, absolutely, the public service should be readying themselves for, should be trying to prevent. But then a key point of what I've said, a key point that I've made through this presentation is that crises in some ways are constructed, they're socially constructed. You're never going to be able to a public service alone is never going to be able to fully stop crises because they're, in some cases, manufactured by the media or politicians, or the interaction between the media, the public and politicians. And we're never going to be able to prevent those sorts of crises.
Okay, we have a question from Alison. Alison, if you can turn your camera and on and your mute off, we'll cross to you so you can ask your question.
Hi, sorry. Am I still on mute? No.
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
No, that's fine. I was just interested with the case study on the GFC. There seem to be a lot of similarities with regards to governments propping up the local economy. I'm just wondering, were there any lessons from the GFC that could be used to ensure that the COVID financial impact that obviously demonstrated by the federal budget deficit, whether there's anything that could be used to mitigate that situation occurring?
Thanks, Alison. It's a good question, and the answer is yes, absolutely. And the Reserve Bank, the Commonwealth Government and state governments have already started moving in that direction. I mean, there's a lot of sort of debate in economic policy about how effective is fiscal stimulus. But the GFC certainly, notwithstanding the ongoing political debates about whether fiscal stimulus of that size and scale and scope was necessary in the GFC, there is no doubt in Australia that fiscal stimulus from the Commonwealth Government did in fact make a difference in terms of into recession. And there is also no doubt now, and it's not just me saying this, but it's research and by bodies like the OECD and the IMF, the amount of fiscal stimulus that countries like Australia are putting into the economy now is moderating what the impacts of the COVID restrictions would otherwise have been.
Thanks, Joanne. Now we are on time, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks very much, Alison, for asking an interesting question. And that was the first time we've crossed live, so we've also achieved another innovation today. But on behalf of the community of policy professionals, thank you, Joanne, for taking the time to speak with us and sharing your experience and views on managing crises and managing ourselves during times of crises. I'd also like to thank thank Indy for her support behind the scenes, and of course you, our audience, for your interest and enthusiasm in policy. We'll be back on Thursday the 19th of November with Liz Livingston on whether policy is still needed in an age of delivery. Until then, take care.